For this project, I'm paying homage to one of my favorite consoles as a kid and making a laser cut Game Boy. That particular project started when I got a membership at Fab Lab and went to take a class. I originally got a membership at Fab Lab because I wanted to learn how to use their CNC machine. But I quickly found out that CNC machines and I just don't get along. And so I decided to learn how to use a laser cutter instead. So I took the class, and after it was over, I was trying to figure out what was the first thing that I wanted to make on a laser cutter. And so I decided to make a scale version of one of my favorite games as a kid, Link's Awakening on the Game Boy. To start, I measured out the game cartridge and went into Inkscape and drew and sized a rectangle to create an outline for the cartridge. Also, making sure to include the notch. I found a graphic for the cartridge, imported it into Inkscape, went to Path and Trace Bitmap, figured out what a good brightness cutoff was, and fit the new layer into my cartridge outline that I made. I did the same process for the Link's Awakening logo. Since you can't cut angles with the laser cutter, I simulated that angled part by taking out pieces of the top layer of the cartridge. With my cartridge outline designed, I needed to figure out what thickness of wood I was going to use so that I can figure out how many layers I needed to make. I ended up going with 3mm plywood and figured I would need 3 layers. After duplicating the original outline of the cartridge 2 more times and exporting my design to a PDF, I went to Fab Lab to cut it all out on the laser cutter. I really like how this turned out. I mean, it feels like a Game Boy cartridge, despite the fact that it's made out of wood. But after I had made this, I thought to myself, why not just make a Game Boy to go with it? Following that same process, I found a graphic for the Game Boy face. I went and measured the Game Boy, and then set the graphic to scale. Using Trace Bitmap and Shapes, I created elements for the D-pad, Start and Select buttons, and the B and A buttons. Situated all of the elements on the template, and then combined them all. Since I am using 3mm plywood, I figured I would need at least 11 layers to match the thickness of a Game Boy. I made sure to create a slot for the cartridge to slide into, so that you could remove the cartridge like you would in an actual Game Boy. I scaled down the last few layers to give it that angled shape on the back of the Game Boy, and then created the elements and designs for the battery cover on the back. I added my own little mark to it, and the basic template for the Game Boy was done. At this point, I had to make a decision of what to do about the screen. Now, I could have just found a picture of the game and rastered it directly on the top piece of the plywood. Meh. And so I went browsing the internet for ideas. I came across this picture of a paper Game Boy diorama. I liked the idea of a diorama set inside the screen of the Game Boy. I thought that it would give really cool depth and dimension to the picture of the game. So I found the screenshot that I wanted, shaped and traced each of the elements, and then added all of these new elements to my Game Boy template. To give that really cool depth and dimension to the picture, I decided to make it 3 layers deep. The background, and then 2 layers of the characters and elements on top of that. So I took my new design to Fab Lab and printed it all out. One issue that I did discover about printing these really small elements is that you can easily lose them through the grate of the laser printer. So depending on what brand of laser cutter you use, you may have to go fishing for pieces that fall through the cracks. Then it was just a matter of gluing all of the layers together. So this is it, all made up. I mean, removable cartridge and everything. So there were two issues that I did run into while I was putting this together. First is that my ability to perfectly line up multiple layers of wood while gluing them together is lacking. To fix that, I took the outline of the Game Boy that I created and the cartridge that I created to cut out several layers of acrylic to make jigs. Using these, I can fit the layers snugly into the jig and have them all perfectly lined during the glue up. So the second issue I ran into is that even though the cartridge is removable, the diorama in the Game Boy stays the same. I got a recommendation on Instagram to make a version where the diorama is built into the Game Boy cartridge. This would allow you to change cartridges out in the Game Boy and have the dioramas change with the cartridge. I thought that was an amazing idea. I wish I would have thought of it. But let's go do it. I took my template for the cartridge and added enough layers to allow for the designs in the back of the cartridge, as well as the diorama on the front. I also changed the slots on the template for the Game Boy to account for the new, thicker cartridge. I took my new version 2.0 back to FabLab and cut it all out on the laser cutter. I glued all the layers up as I fit them in the jig. Clamped everything down and waited for them to dry to see if it worked. Alright, side note here. Plywood is a very interesting material to work with for a couple reasons, especially when you're using a laser cutter. First off, the plywood needs to be flat. I mean, just flat, super flat. No bowing, no bending, no ripples, nothing. Otherwise, you run into the problem of it not printing out properly or not even cutting all the way through. Now, generally, you won't have this issue with thicker plywoods. But when using a thin plywood like 3mm, it is something to watch out for. The other thing is even though it says 3mm, it's not always exactly 3mm. So you will come across different pieces that are different thicknesses. Because of that, you need to make sure that when you're cutting out the Game Boy and the cartridge, you need to use the same exact thickness of plywood. Otherwise, those very slight thickness differences between the different sheets of plywood will make it so that the cartridge doesn't fit right in the Game Boy. Just a couple things for you to look out for. After taking the jigs apart, everything looked great. I love this design, and now that I have a template for the cartridges, I can go back and design a cartridge for any game that I want to. And so the final touch I wanted to add to this Game Boy was to give it a little bit of color. I watered down some gray paint and some red paint, and added a couple layers to the buttons. I wanted something subtle yet expressive so that it would give it that classic Game Boy look. You know, even though it was made out of wood. This was one of my favorite projects for 2017, and I hope you liked it. If you did, hit the like button. And if you haven't yet already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the future projects that I'll be working on. And to download the templates that I made for the Game Boy and for the cartridge, head over to Patreon. Of course, now I'm in the mood to go and play Link's Awakening on my Game Boy. Now I'm in the mood to just, hang out and play my Game Boy. Sounds dirty.